And I was kind of like, the money I would give to be able to see again. I would rather be poor and sighted than to have a couple $100 guaranteed every week by the government and blind. Hello and welcome to the Blindseyepodcast, the podcast discussing everything you did and didn't want to know about being blind. My name is Connor. Hope everybody is well. Today I'm going to be talking about something a little different, a bit more serious, probably a bit dry, but I'm hoping I can kind of impress upon people who listen why it's important. So that is to do with the disability pension and like the welfare system and how that kind of interacts with each other when you have a disability, and some of the pretty awful things that are going on, which a lot of people may not be very familiar with within Australia. As always, before I get going, if you like what I do, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing, telling your friends, doing anything you can do on whatever device you have. That always helps, and I really appreciate it. Okay, so the reason I wanted to talk about the disability pension is because the disability pension, or the DSP, as it's called in Australia, is a big deal for people who have disabilities, because for those of us who can't work or who find it hard to find work, it basically helps us stay above the poverty line, or in some unfortunate cases, close to the poverty line, or sadly just below the poverty line. And all of this is administered by Centrelink and the government, but there's been some pretty big changes in the last couple of years in Australia when it comes to this kind of stuff. So I'm going to read to you a parts of a media release that comes from the Australian Federation for Disabled Organisations, AFDO, and they have recently announced that with a report that's been done, that over 370,000 people have been shifted from the disability pension onto the job seeker allowance. And the job seeker allowance is now what was called the dole. So if you're on job seeker, you have mutual obligations, like you have to apply for a certain amount of jobs each week. Otherwise, things will get cut altogether, or there'll be penalties involved, that kind of stuff. So first off, 370,000 people have been shifted onto these. The majority of people who've been shifted onto these are people with chronic illnesses like cancer or neurological issues, or people who have severe psychosocial issues, so a lot more kind of mental health concerns. So from the off, that's pretty messed up, because I don't know how a cancer patient ends up on job seeker if they particularly are terminal, or if they have other treatments going on that might stop them from working for the time being or altogether. The other thing that comes with losing your status as being on the disability support pension is that concessions that were afforded to you, like cheaper medication or travel concessions, no longer apply. So there's literally a scenario at the moment where you might have somebody who is on cancer treatment who has just been kicked from the disability pension onto job seeking when they might not be able to do it in the first place. And not only that, but their medications have now been made more expensive, and their ability to travel, assuming they can at all, has been also made more expensive as well. So again, kind of a little bit of a WTF in my opinion. So that's kind of the first off headline, big one. But the other side of this is, obviously this is administered by Centrelink. Anybody in Australia knows who Centrelink is and how they operate. But as somebody with a disability, what can also happen is you need to deal with Centrelink for your disability pension, but Centrelink isn't actually accessible to you in the way that you need it to be because of your disability. So as an example, there's a person in the media release from AVDO who uses sign language, and they need to go to their Centrelink office, and their Centrelink office doesn't have a provision for being able to communicate with that person in sign language. So what happens is you're being forced to deal with this agency who deals with disability payments, but they aren't even equipped to deal with the kind of disability you have and the way they might need to communicate that with you. And that by itself is pretty messed up. But what it also can mean, again, for those of us who know Centrelink and how welfare systems work, is any discrepancies that might pop up in your paperwork or misunderstandings that could be completely to do with miscommunication because of what they haven't provided can then be used to hit you later on as some kind of scum who's trying to take advantage of the system and who doesn't really need it. So it's a weird paradox that can be the case, because surely the resources should exist if that's who's going to be actually dealing with the disability pension. I know in my own case, when I first encountered Centrelink when I was 16 was when I got on the disability pension when I was eligible, and I didn't really want to, which I'll come on to, but at the time we passed along the medical advice from the GP and the specialist saying, hey, irreversible permanent blindness and, 1-2% vision, whatever it might have been. And for the first couple of years, I would get a letter every year basically asking me if I was still blind. Was it still permanent? Could I prove that it was? And all this kind of stuff. And it was kind of like, not only are you having to deal with the fact that you've lost your vision and the daily things that come up with trying to live life in a world that's not really built for you, but then you have this thing which is kind of implying that you're taking them for a ride, and it's like, well, how much more permanent can it be? You've had specialists here tell you, you have documentation, you have a GP telling you, like what part of permanent and irreversible don't you get? So again, it's just like, what's happening? And eventually we just had to kick up a fuss and say, like, what part of this don't you understand? It's not coming back. So can you please stop sending us this crap? The other side of this as well is that depending on your disability depends on your circumstance, which you get to a certain degree. But as an example, I never thought that I'd be glad to be totally blind for all intents and purposes. But when it comes to this issue, it makes my life easier. So because of the severity of my blindness, I get an easier time of it because it's a bit more cut and dry. But as an example, there are people with vision impairment who are considered blind enough or vision impaired enough that employers won't hire them, or definitely won't hire them on the same rate as the general population. So they're considered blind enough that people don't want to employ them. But as far as Centrelink or the government is concerned, they're not considered blind enough not to be working. So then they don't qualify for the disability pension in the same way or without having to jump through lots of hoops. So you can have a situation where somebody is blind enough that nobody will employ them, but they're still stuck on the job seeker allowance where they have to apply for 20 jobs a week. Otherwise, things go their way. But they're having to apply for jobs that either they can't do or that are complete shots in the dark because there might not be enough jobs that are even ones that you think you could do as a blind person. I know with myself, not every job that you come across is something you either are qualified to do or that you can do. But you're basically getting people to tick boxes that isn't going anywhere, and you're holding this poverty line thing over their head. But at the end of the day, if like you're stuck in this limbo between, you're not blind enough for them, but you're blind enough for others. And that must be an awful place to be in. So that's why I say I'm lucky, because for all intents and purposes, I'm blind enough that I can't be caught, touch wood, in that limbo, at least for the time being. I'm sure someone in their wisdom will come up with something in the future. But yeah, that's just a really messed up situation. And it is like, this is kind of a tangent, but it is this funny thing that there are, as a blind person, there are plenty of jobs blind people or vision impaired people can do. But if the employer or the person hiring doesn't think so, then your job opportunity is closed down. But then Centrelink or the government will say, well, you haven't found a job. Why aren't you finding a job? And it's a weird thing, because like if those employers weren't so close-minded or a bit more educated, you'd be able to earn a wage and you wouldn't necessarily even need welfare support. So again, it's just that weird limbo where you're stuck in a position that doesn't make sense, and the blame is being put on you to do more when there are plenty of other parties that could be doing more to rectify the situation, or at least improve it in some people's cases. This kind of brings me on to the whole idea of the shame of the welfare system, because you do feel shame, and for however long, maybe it's always been like this, but there's this real shame attached to needing support, because everyone's heard a 60 Minutes segment on a Sunday night talking about the couple of people who are bludgers who are taking advantage of the system. But you don't hear about all the people who are using it as is necessary and as required, and who are using it as a bit of a safety net, either to keep the head above water or to keep the head above water until their situation changes and their luck turns. But, just like with murder, you hear about the 4 people who died last night, not the 26 million people who had a perfectly fine day. So there's this propaganda that kind of gets put out that everybody's just a dole bludger, everybody is just leeching off the system, or everybody knows somebody who has, therefore that must be what it mostly gets used for. And so basically you end up with a situation where you have a system in place that maybe has 10, 20% of people abusing it. So the other 80% of people who are using it for its intended purpose get treated like thugs and scum and suspects, and are forced into poverty or degrading positions just because we're playing to the minority of people who mess it up. And, those people who mess it up should be dealt with, but dealing with the policy in that way is stupidity, because then what's the point in having the effing thing in the first place? I know myself, when I told some friends that I was on the pension and how it worked, that some people said to me, oh, well, that's unfair. And I was kind of like, the money I would give to be able to see again, I would rather be poor and sighted than to have a couple $100 guaranteed every week by the government and blind. But people don't look at it like that. They just see it as something for nothing. But again, people on welfare are the problem, not the multinationals not paying hundreds of billions in taxes every year, which pays for social services. And again, you feel like you have to defend yourself from the shame of it all. And like, you didn't choose this, situation in life. Again, the money I would give to be able to see, but that's not something I can buy for myself. So it's a hard thing to have to defend, because people just don't think about it like that. So there's a story here on this press release from Avdo that I kind of wanted to share, which kind of encapsulates what I'm talking about perfectly. So there's a person here named John, and this guy was diagnosed with terminal bowel cancer. And when he got out of hospital, he was behind on his income because he couldn't work anymore. He was behind on his rent. So he applied for the disability pension to cover the bases. And because he had bowel cancer, technically it was classed as something that should be covered immediately because of what was happening. But it wasn't. He was told that it would take up to 2 months to kick in. So this guy tried to kill himself because he wasn't able to deal. He didn't have the financial support to be able to live his life. And he was not living with the knowledge that he was going to die of bowel cancer in the next couple of months or year anyway. So basically what happened was his position went downhill, and he was in a vegetative state And then he was told that he would be required under mutual obligation rules to look for work, even though he was in a vegetative state because of his bowel cancer. And things eventually deteriorated to the point where he actually died. But just before he died, his disability pension was actually finally cleared and approved. And because he died, when his family told Centrelink that he had passed away, Centrelink immediately sent them a letter saying that they owed Centrelink money. So that is one of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories of just how fucked up this whole system is, because not only are you dealing with the grief of what's happened to you or to your family members or whatever it might be, but then you're having to engage with this thing that is supposedly a safety net, which is more like a strangling net, which makes your life worse. And it comes to that thing of like, what's the point in having a welfare system that doesn't want you to engage with it, that doesn't really want to function properly? And at the end of the day, most people are kind of in agreement that the whole point is to make things as difficult as possible so that as many people as possible will just turn off trying to engage with it. And then whoever it is can claim, hey, look, we've done such a great job. People don't need as much welfare. But is it that people don't need as much welfare? Or is that you've created a monster that nobody wants to actually engage with because it's making their life harder than it already is? So I just had to share that story because it's beyond messed up. And I am going to share this on the Facebook page as well, so I can be a bit more detail of what was actually written and stuff like that, because yeah, it is worth reading yourself. At the end of the day, this is where I'll end, and I realize that's been kind of depressing, but it's a issue worth highlighting. At the end of the day, unfortunately, we live in a world where welfare is now a bad word, and people have been lied to for years about what's actually happening, or at least on the scale of the abuse that actually takes place, to the point where anybody who engages with these systems is considered a suspect, not a person in need. And then even if they are in a position of need, the resources are either so poorly funded or have so many obstacles in their way in the hope that you'll just leave them alone, that it makes the whole thing pointless or degrading or inhumane. So again, not really a fun episode, but I thought that was important to actually share, because it's Australia. It's a first world country. We live in a rich country. There's plenty of people who can work, who would love to actually be able to get an income if people would employ them in the first place. But for those who can't be employed, let's not make their lives any harder than it needs to be. So hopefully we can get our shit together at some point. But my fingers aren't crossed in a lot of hope. So anyway, on that bright note, I'm going to sign off. So as always, you can get in touch with me by emailing blindseyepodcast@gmail.com. That's BLINDSEYE podcast@gmail.com. I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Blindseyepodcast. I'm on Twitter at Blindseyepod. And if you want one place for it all, my website is blindseyepodcast.com. So thanks very much for listening. Sorry for being bleak, and I'll speak to you in 2 weeks. Cheers.